The chapel had been standing for 600 years before anyone thought to use it again. It sat at the edge of what used to be called Reims, 300 kilometers north of the collapsed sprawl of what used to be Paris, on a hill that had survived the scorching only because the bedrock beneath it was old enough and deep enough to resist the thermal cascades that had liquefied half the continent. The stained glass was gone. The roof had partially collapsed in two places, letting in narrow columns of morning light that fell on the bleached stone floor in long, pale bars. The wooden pews had burned. The brass fixtures had melted and resolidified in shapes that no one had designed. But the walls still stood, and when Commander Alara Voss had first seen the chapel on the survey scan, she had said something that made her adjutant look at her sideways. She had said, "Perfect." Nobody asked her what she meant by that. They rarely asked Alara Voss what she meant by anything anymore. She had a way of arriving at conclusions that other people hadn't started toward yet, and after 7 years of command under the Reclamation Corps, her officers had learned that it was more efficient to wait and watch than to ask and be confused. What she meant was, it was the kind of place that makes a moment permanent, a place that had already survived everything, a place that knew what endurance looked like. And what was coming in 4 hours was going to need to be permanent. The Bloodfang had arrived on Earth 11 months ago. Arrived was the wrong word. It implied intention, volition, a destination chosen and coordinates punched in. The Bloodfang didn't arrive so much as they collided with the solar system on their long migration corridor, a living tide of approximately 900 million individuals following a route their ancestors had carved across 2,000 light-years over 6 centuries. Humanity had been in their path. Earth had been in their path. The fact that humans had colonized 107 other systems by the time of first contact was the only reason this wasn't simply a story about extinction. It was still a story about survival, but those were different things. The Bloodfang were not conquerors in any way the word usually implied. They didn't fortify. They didn't mine or extract or occupy in the colonial sense that human history understood so well. They passed through. They consumed what they needed from a system's resources, mineral deposits, atmospheric compounds, organic biomass, and they moved on. They had been doing this for so long that the concept of wrong didn't seem to apply to it in their moral framework, any more than a river considers the mud it displaces. The problem was that when they passed through, they stripped a planet down to the silicate crust, not because they wanted to, not because they hated what was there. They simply needed what they needed, and what they needed was enormous, and the scale of 900 million individuals in transit was a force of nature in the most literal sense of the phrase. Humanity's response to first contact had been, initially, military. That had gone about as well as you might expect when a civilization that had been at peace with itself for 200 years tried to throw warships at a species that had been in continuous motion through space for 6 centuries and had evolved a physical form that could survive vacuum exposure for up to 40 minutes. The Bloodfang didn't have weapons in the way humans thought about weapons. They had bodies. They had biology. They had numbers that made the concept of attrition irrelevant. The Battle of the Straits of Gibraltar lasted 19 hours. Earth lost 63% of its orbital defense capability. The Bloodfang lost nothing, because there was nothing in humanity's arsenal that could do to them what they could do to each other, and they weren't fighting each other. They were simply moving, and the warships were in the way. It was during the 2nd month of the conflict, if conflict was even the right word, which it increasingly wasn't, that someone in the diplomatic corps finally said the thing that everyone had been afraid to say out loud. They said, "They're not trying to kill us. They're not trying to anything us. We're just in the way." That changed the entire frame. Alara Voss had been a xenolinguist before the scorching, back when that had meant translating archived signals from 3 alien civilizations humanity had discovered, all of them long extinct. She had spent 12 years with dead languages. She had learned to read the shape of a mind in the structure of its grammar, to find the values of a civilization in the metaphors its language considered basic and natural, to feel the loss of something that had once been alive through the silence it had left behind. She understood at a molecular level that a language isn't just sounds or symbols. It's the entire architecture of how a mind organizes reality, and before you could talk to something, you had to understand what talking meant to it. The Bloodfang didn't talk. Not in any way humanity recognized at first. They communicated through a combination of subsonic resonance, pheromone bursts, and a kind of low-frequency electromagnetic pulse that operated through the specialized nodes clustered along their jawline. In the females of the species, the jaw ridge grew into elongated tusks as a marker of status, fertility, and lineage. The nodes themselves were visible only at close range, small organelles that flickered faintly in low light, like bioluminescence in deep water. The diplomatic teams had spent 8 months just building instruments sensitive enough to detect the full spectrum of their communication. Most of that time was spent in failure, and the failures were educational. Alara had spent those 8 months doing something different. She had been studying a particular female. The Bloodfang social structure was organized around matrilineal bloodlines, with authority flowing through the female line and enforced by what the xenobiologists had labeled the royal clade. A subset of females who were larger, longer-tusked, and who seemed to function as navigators, decision-makers, and the closest equivalent the species had to a governing body. There were 12 of them in the current migration. They traveled at the center of the corridor, surrounded by the wider population, and their resonance patterns were the ones that determined direction and timing, and the 1,000 other decisions that kept 900 million individuals moving in the same direction. Alara had not chosen to study one of the 12. She had chosen to study the one who wasn't at the center. This female traveled at the edge of the migration, always at the edge, never at the center. She didn't participate in the group resonance events that seemed to function as the migration's collective decision-making process. She performed certain functions. Alara's team could track a directional influence in her outputs that suggested she was contributing to navigation. But she was always slightly apart, always slightly sideways to the herd, and her outputs had a specific quality that the xenobiologists had noted in their reports without understanding its significance. Alara had noted it too. She had understood it immediately, in the way you understand something that you've also experienced. She just hadn't had a word for it yet. She had started calling this female the princess, before she'd understood why that word felt right. By the time she understood, the name had stuck. Her name, in the phonetic transliteration her team had developed from the Bloodfang resonance patterns, was Vrethka. Alara had stopped using the clinical designation R7 when she realized she was doing what you do with things you've decided aren't worth caring about. You give them numbers instead of names. She had told her team, if we're going to do this properly, we do it properly. Vrethka it was. Vrethka was the last of her specific royal clade. This was the fact that Alara had spent 3 months working out, and it was the fact that changed everything. The others had died, not in battle, not from disease. They had aged out, one by one, across the long migration, across 700 years of movement through the dark. In the Bloodfang biology, the royal clade females were longer lived than the general population, but not immortal, and the migration had been a long one, and Vrethka had outlived them all. She was the sole surviving member of a bloodline that should have had 30 to 40 individuals at full health. Among the Bloodfang, a royal clade female without her line was not simply alone. She was, in a deeply structural sense, incomplete. Her authority derived from her position within a web of relationships. A navigator required a fixed web to navigate from. Without the web, the position meant nothing. She was a title with no domain, a coordinate system with no origin point, a crown suspended in the air with no head beneath it. The other Royal Clade members acknowledged her formally and functionally ignored her. They included her outputs in the collective navigation. She was too good at it for them not to, but she was not consulted on decisions. She did not participate in the ceremonies. She stood at the edge and she sent her pulses into the migration, and the migration incorporated them without acknowledgement, the way a river incorporates a tributary without naming it. Alara had been watching this for 3 months before she understood what she was seeing. Loneliness, it turned out, looked the same in every species. The specific texture of it, the way the body carries it differently from ordinary solitude, the way the eyes move when there's something you want to say and no one to say it to, these things don't require a shared language to be legible. They're older than language. They're older than anything that could be called civilization. Alara knew this because she had been carrying the same thing herself for years, and she recognized the shape of it in Vrethka the same way you recognize a word in a foreign language that sounds almost like the word in your own. She sent the first signal 3 months after she started watching Vrethka, and 2 months after she'd built the instruments necessary to send something on the Bloodfang frequency. It was not a message, there was no content in it. It was a single low-frequency electromagnetic pulse, built to match the wavelength of the Bloodfang's own ambient communication band. The Xenocommunications team thought she had lost her mind. Her adjutant, Sergeant Callow, who had been with her for 4 years and was 26 years old, and had the kind of steady, quiet competence that either indicates deep peace or profound exhaustion. Callow had asked her, very carefully, what she was trying to say. She had said, "I'm here." He had said, "That's it." She had said, "That's everything." He had thought about this for exactly 3 seconds, which was how long it typically took him to evaluate whether something Alara was doing was insane or brilliant, and then he had helped her refine the instrument calibration. She sent the pulse once a day for 14 days. Nothing happened. The Xenocommunications team continued to think she had lost her mind. Alara continued to refine the calibration and watch the data feeds. On the 14th day, at 03:47 in the morning, Earth Standard Time, not that the morning meant anything to the Bloodfang, whose circadian rhythm seemed to be tuned to something other than a 24-hour day. Alara was awake at her workstation, not because she had planned to be, but because she almost never slept through the night anymore and had stopped fighting that particular fact about herself years ago. She was awake, and she saw the response come in. Not content. A return frequency, a mirrored pulse, barely distinguishable from background noise on the monitoring display. She almost missed it. She would have missed it if she hadn't spent 2 weeks learning to look for exactly that pattern. She saw it, and she sat very still, and she stared at the numbers on the display for what might have been a minute or might have been longer. Then she rewound the visual feed from Vrethka's position and looked at the timestamp. Vrethka had been at the edge of the migration, alone, in the position she always occupied. But in the moment before the pulse went out, she had turned. Not her body. The Bloodfang didn't turn their entire bodies toward things the way humans did. Their visual and sensory apparatus was distributed differently. She had turned her jaw nodes. She had oriented the most sensitive communicative organs she possessed toward the planet beneath her, and the pulse had come from those nodes, and she had held the orientation for approximately 30 seconds after sending it. It was not a small thing to change the direction of your attention for 30 seconds in a species whose awareness was collective and continuous. It was, in its way, a very large thing. Alara looked at the display for a long time. Then she opened her log and wrote 1 line, "She heard me." After that it moved faster, not quickly by any human measure. The exchanges built layer by layer, like a language being constructed from scratch by 2 people who didn't share a single word but who shared a fundamental grammar. The grammar of paying attention to something with care and waiting and paying attention again. Alara was right that you had to understand what talking meant to a species before you could talk to them. For the Bloodfang, talking was not an exchange of information. Information was almost incidental. Talking was an exchange of presence. It was the act of saying, "I am here, and I know that you are there, and this knowing is the foundation of everything else." It took 6 months to build a vocabulary from this. Not 6 months of steady progress. 6 months of 2 steps forward and 1 step sideways and 1 step backward, and a week where nothing happened at all because Vrethka was participating in a navigation cycle that consumed all her output bandwidth, and Alara spent that week reviewing every earlier exchange and recalibrating everything she thought she knew. What she arrived at was not a translation. It was a framework for translation, a set of structural principles that would let her team, over time, build the actual dictionary. She gave the framework to the Xenolinguistics division and went back to watching Vrethka. 8 months in, Vrethka sensed something different. It was a complex resonance pattern of a type they hadn't seen before, longer, more layered, with structural elements that suggested intentional construction rather than ambient communication. The instruments took 6 days to fully record and decode it. The Xenolinguistics team argued about the translation for 3 weeks. 2 senior analysts produced incompatible interpretations and wrote increasingly sharp memos at each other. Alara read the memos, read both translations, looked at the raw data, and sat very still for a long time. Then she called a meeting and said, "I need a chapel." The council had been furious. Not about the chapel they had managed to absorb. What had furious them was the reduction of their 17 conditions to 3, and then the reduction of those 3 to a structure the council hadn't approved, and Alara had implemented anyway by the time the official objection arrived. The objection had arrived with a formal reprimand. Alara had acknowledged the reprimand, agreed that proper channels were important, and pointed out that the ceremony was already scheduled, and the alternative was explaining to 900 million Bloodfang individuals, including 12 royal clade navigators, why humanity had changed its mind about the Covenant at the 48-hour mark. The council had argued for another 4 hours and then agreed. Callow had found her in the chapel afterward, walking the nave in the early evening light, and he had said, "They're going to make your life difficult after this." She had said, "They were already making my life difficult before this. This will be difficult." He had said, "You're okay with that." She had said, "I've been okay with difficult for a long time." He hadn't asked her what she meant. He rarely asked her what she meant by things. It was one of the reasons she kept him around. Vrethka's offer, when Alara finally had a complete translation she trusted, was this. In the Bloodfang migration structure, there was a ritual for which Alara's team had cycled through a dozen inadequate approximations before arriving at the one she used in her report to the council: covenant bonding. A ritual by which an isolated royal clade female could reconstitute her bloodline by performing a binding ceremony with an outside individual of sufficient status. The Bloodfang determined status through accumulated navigational experience and through the quality of a being's presence in the communication field, not through rank as humans understood it, not through resources or territory or the number of people who would follow your orders, through attention, through the depth and steadiness of being there, fully, in the exchange. Vrethka had been observing Alara's signals for 8 months. She had evaluated the quality of Alara's presence in their exchanges, and she had determined, through criteria that Alara's team was still working to fully understand, that Alara was of sufficient status for the Covenant. What the Covenant would do was this: Vrethka would formally include humanity in the migration's relational structure, not as territory, not as resources, not as a subject population or a protectorate or any of the other categories that human diplomacy had been trying to map onto the situation for nearly a year, as kin, as the reconstituted clade, as the people with whom Vrethka was in relationship, and whose survival was therefore structurally connected to the migration's decisions. And what the migration would do, in exchange for this inclusion, alter the corridor, not dramatically, not at great cost, a 1.7-degree shift relative to the solar ecliptic, enough to place Earth and the inner planets entirely outside the migration's resource consumption zone, was achievable without significant disruption to the 900 million individuals who needed the corridor to continue. It was not what the migration would prefer. It was what the migration could do, if one of its royal clade navigators decided it was right. Vrethka had decided it was right. What she needed now was for the covenant to be performed properly, so that the decision had structural weight, so that the other royal clade members could not dismiss it as an irregular action taken by an irregular female who had no standing. She needed a witness. She needed a ceremony. She needed the thing to be done in a way that could not be undone. The closest human word for what she was offering was covenant. But the word Vrethka had used, the specific resonance pattern, when Alara pulled it out of the translation and listened to it in isolation, when she played it back at 2 in the morning with headphones on in her office. The word the Bloodfang used for this relationship was the word for the relationship between a navigator and a fixed star. Reference point, home bearing. The thing you look toward to know where you are. Alara had sat with that for a long time. Then she had gone to find Callow and told him she needed a chapel. The morning of the ceremony, Alara dressed without a mirror. This was not symbolic. She had simply never owned a mirror, not since the scorching, when her apartment in what had been Lyon had burned with everything in it, and she had never replaced the one she'd lost because she had never found the time, and then the time had become years, and eventually the absence of a mirror had become a habit rather than an oversight. She wore her Reclamation Corps formal dress, charcoal gray, the silver rank pins at the collar, the fabric stiff from the fabricator because there hadn't been time to break it in. Her aide had wanted to do something with her hair. Alara had said no. Her aide had suggested that the representative of humanity in the most significant diplomatic event in human history might consider presenting herself with some degree of formal. Alara had said no again, more clearly. She left her hair down. It was dark and going gray at the temples, and there was nothing she could do about either of those things, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Callow was waiting for her in the corridor outside her quarters at 5:30 in the morning. He was not in dress uniform. He was in his standard field kit, practical gray, no rank insignia on display, his pack slung over one shoulder. She had looked at this for a moment and had said nothing. He had said nothing. They had walked to the transport in silence. She understood without it being said. He was dressing for function, not ceremony. He was dressing the way you dress when you're not sure what might happen and you want to be ready for it. He was dressing for the world where things went wrong. She loved him for that in the specific way you love someone who keeps showing up, who keeps being practical when everything else is trying to be historical. In the transport, she said, "How are you feeling?" He said, "Fine, how are you feeling?" She said, "Scared." He looked at her. She was not someone who said that. She was not someone who said most things about her own interior state. She had learned, through years of command, that there were things you kept private because the alternative was using up resources that other people needed more than she did. But this was Callow, and this was the morning of the ceremony, and she was tired of the habit of privacy when the moment didn't require it. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet when she said something that needed space around it. Then he said, "Good, that means you know what this is." She said, "I know exactly what this is." He said, "Then you're ready." She sat with that for the rest of the drive, and found, to her surprise, that he was right. Knowing exactly what something is, it turned out, was most of what being ready meant. The chapel was a 40-minute walk up the hill from the transport point. Alara did not ride. The honor guard had transport. She walked. Callow walked with her, slightly behind her left shoulder in the way he always positioned himself, not exactly a bodyguard position, not exactly an advisor position, something between the two that he had arrived at naturally and that she had never named. The honor guard went ahead, 24 of them, in full dress uniform, with the specific rigid bearing that the Corps used for ceremonial occasions. They reached the chapel and took their positions at the entrance and stood very still and waited. Alara and Callow reached the top of the hill with 10 minutes to spare before the designated time. The morning was clear and cold, the sky a pale blue that would deepen as the sun got higher. The chapel sat at the top of the hill in the way that things sit when they've been sitting in the same place for 600 years, not imposing exactly, but settled, sure of itself. It had been through the scorching and it was still here, and it didn't seem particularly surprised about that. Alara stood at the top of the hill and looked at the sky and waited. Vrethka came down from the upper atmosphere in a small craft that the Bloodfang used for what the xenobiologists had labeled ground interface. A narrow, organic-looking vehicle, matte gray-black, shaped less like a ship than like something that had been grown rather than built. It set down 200 meters from the chapel, far enough to give the honor guard time to process the sight without reacting to it, and it sat there for a full minute before the hatch opened. Alara had seen visual records of Vrethka many times. She had studied Vrethka's movement and posture, and the angle of her tusks through satellite imagery and drone footage for nearly a year. She had watched her turn toward the planet in the middle of the night and send a pulse so quiet it was almost background noise. She thought she knew what she was looking at. She had not understood scale. Vrethka was large the way mountains are large, not visually overwhelming in the first second, but with a quality of mass and presence that rearranged the space around her as she moved. She stood perhaps 2.5 meters tall, with the wide-set, low-centered build of a species that had evolved in high-gravity environments and carried that engineering through the millennia even when they were no longer in high gravity. Her skin was the gray-green of deep-sea water, not flat but textured, crossed with the banded scarring that marked every bloodfang who had survived a full 50-year migration cycle. The first cycle left 1 band. The second left 2. Vrethka had 7 bands. Not of age, but of accumulated migration distance, which was how the bloodfang measured time and status simultaneously. 700 years of movement through the dark, marked in her own flesh. Her tusks curved upward from her lower jaw, ivory white and long enough to matter, filed at the base in 3 horizontal grooves, the marker of the royal clade, the sign that said, "Navigator, decision-maker, the one who knows where we are." She wore nothing that translated as clothing. The bloodfang didn't need it, and in their migration culture didn't use it. She wore her own history, the banding, the tusks, the jaw nodes that caught the morning light and looked, from this distance, like small pearls laid along the line of her jaw. She stopped when she was perhaps 50 meters from Alara, and she looked at her. Alara looked back. Between them was the hill and the bleached stone, and the morning light striping the ground through the chapel's broken roof. Callow was 2 paces behind Alara's left shoulder. The honor guard was at the chapel entrance, 24 of them, very still. Alara reached into her coat pocket and took out the resonance device her team had built. It looked like a tuning fork mounted on a circuit board, which was essentially what it was. She held it in her right hand. She pressed the activation switch. She sent the pulse. The same pulse she had been sending for a year. Same frequency, same wavelength, same duration. No content, just presence. "I'm here." Vrethka's jaw nodes flickered. The pulse that came back registered clean and strong in Alara's earpiece, the clearest signal she had ever received from her. "I know I'm here too." Alara had spent 3 months preparing for the exchange of presence that was the core of the bloodfang bonding ritual. Not preparing the logistics, not preparing the ceremony, preparing herself. The ritual involved standing within range of the other's full communication field and doing nothing else. Not speaking, not performing, not managing the moment or the impression or the vast audience of historical significance that surrounded it. Just being there fully, in the specific way that the Bloodfang could detect and evaluate, and which formed the foundation of what they considered a relationship. Being fully there in the Bloodfang sense meant something very specific, the absence of the interior distance between yourself and your own experience. You could be afraid, you could be grieving, you could be carrying anything that was true for you. What you could not do was stand at the far end of the room from it, looking at it across all that empty space. What you could not do was hide. The Ursas from the old conflict files, the creatures the Bloodfang had used in their early territorial expansions, in the ancient history that Alara's team had partially reconstructed from migration records, the Ursas had hunted by detecting fear. Not fear itself, but the specific pattern of a mind that was not present in its own experience. The pattern of something that was running calculations about the fear instead of simply feeling it. The Ursas could track that pattern the way a predator tracks movement. The Royal Clade Navigators, Alara's team had theorized, perceived something similar in the beings they evaluated for Covenant eligibility. Not fear, not the absence of fear, the presence or absence of genuine interior contact with your own experience. The question of whether you were actually there or whether you were somewhere else, watching yourself from a safe distance. Alara had hired a meditation teacher. She had not told anyone except Callow. She had spent 3 months, in the evenings after her official duties were finished, sitting in a room in Brussels and learning to stop standing at the far end of the room from herself. It had been the hardest thing she'd done in 7 years of hard things. Her mind was a machine that didn't stop. It listed things and assessed things and categorized and prioritized and filed, and it had kept her alive through the scorching, through her husband's death, through her daughter's death, through everything that had happened since. It was a very efficient machine, and it ran on fear the way an engine runs on fuel, and she had been feeding it fear for so long that fear was indistinguishable from its normal operation. Her instructor, a small, patient woman named Dr. Pema, who had survived the scorching in a monastery in what was left of Bhutan, and who had a quality of steadiness that Alara found both infuriating and deeply necessary. Dr. Pema had told her that presence was not an achievement. It was a surrender. You couldn't decide to be present. You could only stop deciding not to be. In the 2nd month, Alara had cried in the middle of a session. Not because of the meditation, exactly. Because she had stopped managing the thing she was always managing, and what had been underneath it was her daughter's face, and she had not let herself look at that face directly in 3 years. Dr. Pema had not made anything of it. She had just said, "Yes, that's what's there. Now you know where it lives." After that it had gone differently. She walked the 50 meters alone. She left Callow behind. She left the honor guard behind. She left the chapel and everything that belonged to the life she had been conducting for 7 years. She walked across the pale morning grass, through the bars of light coming off the stone, toward the figure that was not human and had never been human, and had been sending her signals across the dark for a year. She stopped when she was close enough to see the specific color of Vrethka's eyes. She had not known what to expect. The recordings hadn't captured color well. What she saw was an iridescent amber green, like light filtered through old church glass, and it hit her in a way she hadn't anticipated, some associative trigger. Something about the chapel behind her, something about the morning, something about standing in front of something ancient and patient that had seen enough to know what seeing was worth. Vrethka's jaw nodes produced a sound that was not quite audible. It was a deep subsonic chord, below the threshold of human hearing, and Alara felt it in her sternum and in the back of her skull and somewhere below that, in the place where things are felt before they're thought. Her earpiece registered the frequencies, and the translation algorithms ran and produced nothing useful, which was fine, because Alara didn't need a translation. She knew what it was. It was the opening of a door. She stood in it. She did not perform readiness. She did not compose her face into the expression of historic dignity that the honor guard was presumably maintaining 20 meters behind her. She stood in the morning light in her stiff formal uniform with her dark and going gray hair down and her hands loose at her sides, and she felt what she felt, which was afraid and tired and sad in the specific way she had been sad for 3 years, and also something else, something that she didn't have a clean word for, something that was adjacent to hope but quieter than hope, more patient, and she didn't move away from any of it. She let Vrethka see her. Not the commander, not the xenolinguist, not the woman who had been working so hard and so long that she had stopped remembering what she was working toward. Just a human being who had lost what she loved and kept going anyway, who was standing on a hill in the ruins of a civilization that had been consumed by fire and was still standing, still turning towards signals in the dark, still sending "I'm here" into the void on the chance that something out there would hear it and send it back. 3 minutes passed. They were the longest 3 minutes of her life, and also among the most quiet. Vrethka's jaw nodes produced a final pattern, long and sustained and specific, and Alara's earpiece processed it, and the translation came through, and it was a single word. A word the xenolinguists had spent weeks arguing about, that had appeared in their translation files as a dozen different approximations, that Alara had listened to in recordings at 2 in the morning, alone, and had cried the first time she heard it, and not been able to explain to anyone why. The closest translation was, "I see you," but that was not quite right either. The Bloodfang distinction was finer than that. Not "I see you," "I perceive you." I register your full presence. I confirm that you are real and that you are here and that this knowing changes the shape of my navigation. You are a fixed point for me now. You are real, you are here, you matter to where I'm going. Alara had been preparing for 3 months, and she still was not entirely prepared for that. The document signing took 4 minutes. Callow had the document ready, printed on paper as well as stored digitally, because the Bloodfang did not use digital, and the resonance mark Vrethka would leave on the paper was admissible under the emergency diplomatic authority that the Council had granted 2 days ago, and then tried to rescind, and then granted again. Alara signed it with the same pen she had used to sign her commission papers 12 years ago, which was either sentimentality or precision, and she had never been sure which. Vrethka pressed one jaw node to the corner of the document for approximately 10 seconds. This constituted, under Bloodfang legal custom, a binding mark of personal authority. The terms: the migration corridor would alter by 1.7 degrees relative to the solar ecliptic, placing the Bloodfang route at sufficient distance from the solar system that Earth and the inner planets would be entirely outside the resource consumption zone. In exchange, humanity would share navigational data, stellar cartography, the same maps human ships used, formatted through the communication bridge they had spent 8 months building. They would share a map of the universe. That was the deal, that was all of it. The honor guard went through their ceremony, which the Council had insisted on, and which Alara found she genuinely didn't mind. The Corps had earned the right to stand in dress uniform on a hill that was still standing and mark the moment. She watched from around the side of the chapel, where she had gone to sit on a section of low, broken wall and look at the morning for a while. Vrethka had followed her. This had not been planned. The protocol had her departing for her craft immediately after the document signing, but she had followed Alara around the side of the chapel, and she had stood near the wall with the ambient quality of someone who didn't need to be anywhere else for a few minutes, and Alara had found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind. They sat in something that was not quite silence. The honor guard was audible around the front. A bird somewhere in the ruined roof was making a great deal of noise about a perceived injustice that Alara couldn't identify. Vrethka's jaw nodes produced the slow, quiet frequency that Alara had learned to recognize as ambient presence, not transmitting content, just existing in the shared space. Alara reached into her inside coat pocket and found the small object she had been carrying for 3 weeks, since she had decided to bring it. A photograph printed on paper, mounted in a thin frame that had been her mother's habit and then her own. It showed a girl of about 9 standing in a field somewhere green, laughing at something outside the frame, her hair going in 3 directions because of the wind. Alara had taken this photograph 10 years ago, on a day that she had not known would be significant, and it had been in her pocket on the day of the scorching, and that was the only reason she still had it. She held it where Vrethka could see it. She said out loud in human words that Vrethka couldn't understand. Her name was Myra. This is who I'm doing it for. Vrethka looked at the photograph for a long time with those amber-green eyes. The nodes were still for a moment, which was unusual. Vrethka's nodes were almost never fully still. Then they produced a single resonance pattern, specific and careful, and Alara's earpiece processed it and gave her the translation. The translation was, the thing that was and continues. The xenolinguists had a note on this one. It was not exactly memory. The Bloodfang didn't distinguish memory from presence the way humans did. For them, the dead were a form of the present tense. A navigator looks backward at fixed stars to know where she is now. The dead are fixed stars. They don't go away. They become the reference points you navigate from. The things that were, that continue to be, because you continue to carry them. Alara sat with that for a long time, in the morning light, on the broken wall of a chapel that had survived everything. She sat with it until it settled somewhere she could carry it. Then she put the photograph back in her pocket. She said to no one in particular, or to everyone, "I think we're going to be all right." Callow found her there 20 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee. She had long since stopped asking him how he managed these things. He sat down on the wall beside her and handed her a cup, and the morning light was doing something extraordinary with the bleached stone, turning it the color of warm sand, and the bird had finished its argument with the universe, and the honor guard had wrapped up whatever they were doing. He said, "Did it work?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because she came in person. She didn't have to. She could have sent the route alteration through the migration's collective navigation outputs, and we'd have received it as a data change. She could have sent a proxy or a signal or nothing at all. She came herself." He thought about that. He said, "Why?" Alara looked at the place on the hill where Vrethka was still standing. She had risen from beside the wall and was standing now, looking out at the horizon with her jaw nodes producing their slow ambient frequency, the 7 bands of her migration history visible in the morning light. She said, because the thing she was doing was too important to do alone, because she wanted a witness, because some things only become real when someone sees them happen. Callow drank his coffee and was quiet for a while. Then he said, "That's very human of her." Alara said, "Or it's very Bloodfang of us." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them had an answer to that, which was probably the right place to leave it. 3 days after the ceremony, the migration route alteration was confirmed by Earth's orbital tracking systems. The Bloodfang corridor had shifted 1.7 degrees. The inner planets were safe. The news moved through human civilization the way very large things move, first in fragments that didn't cohere, then in waves as the fragments connected, then in a kind of stunned collective silence as people tried to understand what had actually happened. The council issued statements. Military command issued separate statements. Religious organizations, media platforms, philosophical societies, and an enormous number of people who simply had feelings about it all issued their own statements. Alara wasn't at any of the celebrations. She was at a workstation in the Reclamation Corps headquarters in what remained of Brussels, opening a new research file and beginning to outline the work that needed to happen next. The navigational cartography exchange was the immediate priority. The Bloodfang had sent their first data package within hours of the ceremony, and it was dense, and the translation frameworks they'd built were not fully adequate to it yet, and 47 years was a lot of distance to cover, and they needed to start immediately. Callow came in at midnight and told her she should sleep. She said, 47 years of migration corridor. Their cartographic notation system doesn't match ours in structure. We need to rebuild the bridge from the communication framework upward. That means at minimum 6 months of foundational work before we can even begin to parse the full dataset they've sent. She didn't have time to sleep. He said, "You said we." She said, "Yes, obviously." He said, "You realize that makes you the beginning of something." She set down her pen. She looked at the wall for a moment, at the place where the window would have been if the windows had survived the scorching. Outside it was dark. The city was doing what cities do at midnight, the hum and scatter of it, the lights, the sense of something enormous just barely contained in walls and streets, and the ordinary arrangements of human life. She said, "I know." He said, "Is that all right?" She looked at the workstation, the open file, the 47 years of work ahead of her. The maps to be built, and the language to be learned, and the signals to send into the dark on the reasonable expectation that something out there was paying enough attention to answer. She thought about the first pulse she'd sent, a year ago. She thought about the 14 days of nothing, and the moment at 3 in the morning when the return pulse came in barely distinguishable from background noise. She thought about Vrethka turning toward the planet in the dark, reorienting her most sensitive organs toward a signal she hadn't expected to hear. She thought about a girl laughing in a green field. She said, "Yes, it's all right." And she turned back to the work. The last thing Vrethka did before returning to the migration was hold position at the edge of the atmosphere for 8 minutes. The monitoring team flagged it immediately. They called Ilara. She left her workstation and went to the display room and looked at the feed. Vrethka's craft hovering at the boundary between the planet's air and the black beyond, her jaw nodes producing a long, complex resonance pattern that the instruments were struggling to fully capture. The xenolinguistics team spent 2 days on the translation. When they brought it to Ilara, it was the longest text they had produced from Bloodfang source material, and when she read it, she was grateful she had been alone in her office, because she was crying before she reached the middle of it. What Vrethka had said, as near as the translation could render it, was something like this. "I have traveled 2,000 light years, and before this planet I was the last of my line, and I had been the last for long enough that I had forgotten what it meant to be part of something. I performed the functions. I navigated. I held the shape of a navigator without the substance of one, without the web that navigation requires." And then something on this small burned planet said, "I'm here," into the dark, and kept saying it, and did not stop saying it when there was no answer, and did not stop saying it when the answer was barely there, and did not stop saying it because it understood, on whatever level a being understands such things, that the saying of it was the thing that mattered and not the receiving. "I was here too. I sent that back and I meant it. When I look back across the distance, I will look here. When I need to know where I am, I will look here. This is a fixed star now. This is a home bearing. I did not expect to find a home bearing on a burned planet in a system that was never in my navigation plan. But the universe is large, and the fixed stars are where they are, and you don't choose them, you find them. I found one here." Ilara read it 3 times. She sat in her office for a long time after the 3rd reading, looking at nothing in particular, letting it settle. Then she went to her workstation, and she opened a new transmission file, and she built a pulse on the Bloodfang frequency, and she wrote into it, through the instruments and the frameworks and the 1.5 years of painstaking construction, the closest thing she could send to what she wanted to say. "We are here, we have always been here. We will still be here when you look back across 2,000 light years in the dark. We are a fixed star. We are a home bearing. Navigate by us. We will be here." She transmitted it. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She knew it had been received in the same way she knew all things that mattered, not through data, not through confirmation, but through the understanding that some things don't require confirmation because they are simply true. She made coffee. She went back to work. 7 months later, the Bloodfang migration passed the heliopause, the outer boundary of the solar system, where the sun's influence runs out and true interstellar space begins. Earth's Deep Space Monitoring Array tracked the corridor for as long as the instruments could manage, watching the 900 million individuals move in their long tide through the dark between the stars. They were going somewhere that human ships hadn't reached yet. Someday they would. But not yet. For now it was enough to have the maps, to have the shared cartography, the language being built word by word and year by year from the frameworks Alara's team had constructed, to have the signals going back and forth across the dark, growing more complex as the frameworks grew more sophisticated, growing richer as each side learned to say more precisely what it meant, to have two civilizations moving through the same universe with the knowledge that each one knew the other was there. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole of something very large. Callow had a daughter by then. She was 2 months old and her name was Myra, and he hadn't explained the name to anyone and nobody had asked, which was the right call by everyone involved. He brought her to the office once, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, which violated at least 15 protocols, and Alara had not said a word about it. He had handed the baby to her without asking whether she wanted to hold her, which was also the right call, because if he had asked she would have said no because she would have been managing the moment, and she didn't need to manage the moment. She held the baby for 4 minutes. She counted because that was what she did. The baby had the completely serious face that very new humans have before they learn that seriousness is supposed to indicate something. The face that suggests that consciousness is still surprising them, and they haven't decided yet what to do about that. She looked up at Alara with that face, entirely present, entirely undefended, making no calculations at all. Alara thought, "You will live to see things I can't imagine." And the baby looked at her like she already knew. On the wall of the chapel outside Reims, someone had painted something. It appeared in the 6 months after the ceremony. No one had authorized it. No one claimed responsibility. It was a mural that ran along the inside of the nave for 30 meters, painted in colors bright enough that they were visible from outside through the gaps in the stone, and what it showed was this. On one side, a human figure in a gray coat, small against the bleached stone, one hand extended. On the other side, a figure that was not human, large, wide-set, with tusks that caught the painted light, with nodes along the jawline that looked like small stars. Between them, nothing. The space between two people reaching toward each other across a distance that is real but not impassable. And in the space, painted in letters small enough that you had to get close to read them, the words, "I'm here, are you?" And below that, in different paint, different handwriting, clearly added later by a different person who had come and looked and felt the need to answer, "Yes, I'm here too." The chapel had been standing for 600 years before anyone thought to use it again. After the mural appeared, people started going there, not for ceremonies, not for anything official. Just to sit in the nave in the light that came in through the broken roof and look at the mural and be in a place that had held something true, and know that the universe is large, and that it is not empty, and that the signals you send into the dark are not lost even when you can't hear them come back. It was not a grand thing. It was not a monument. It was a painting on an old wall in a chapel that had survived everything, saying the simplest thing there was to say. "I'm here, are you?" Some things are the whole of it, and this was one of them, and it was enough. what the history files would later record as the Reims Covenant was, in the immediate aftermath, primarily characterized by what did not happen. The council had expected celebrations. They had expected the kind of relief that expresses itself in noise and motion, in crowds gathering in public squares, in a collective exhale so large it could be measured. They had built a media framework for it. They had prepared statements for the Prime General, the senior diplomatic attaché, and 6 other officials whose names would appear in the historical record. What happened instead was quieter. People went to the windows and looked at the sky. They went out into the streets and stood in small groups and talked in low voices. They called people they hadn't called in a while, and some of those calls were about the news, and some of them were about other things, older things, things that had been waiting in the back of the mind for a moment when there was finally room for them. Ilara received a message from her mother-in-law, who was living in one of the subsurface colonies on Mars and who she hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years. The message said only, "I heard about the ceremony. Your husband would have been proud. His daughter would have been proud. I am proud. Come see me when you can." Ilara read this message 3 times and then filed it under, things to think about when there is time. She was not sure when there would be time. She was not sure there would ever be time in the way she meant when she said that phrase. But she held it, and that was something. The first real evidence that the Covenant was working came 6 weeks after the ceremony. A small Bloodfang scouting group, 5 individuals, moving ahead of the main migration in the way Ilara's team now understood was standard pre-transit assessment, had been detected in the outer solar system, moving through the asteroid belt in a pattern that previous behavior suggested was resource evaluation. Pre-Covenant, this would have triggered a military response alert. The defense systems would have come online. Several things that were difficult to undo would have been set in motion. Instead, Ilara's team sent a navigational data packet on the Bloodfang frequency, including updated cartographic information about the asteroid belt's resource density. Information that indicated correctly that the specific region the scouts were evaluating was relatively resource-poor compared to several zones further along the migration corridor. The scouts changed course within 40 minutes. They moved to the zones Ilara's team had indicated. They completed their assessment. They sent a brief resonance pulse, short, clearly intentional, directed toward Earth, that the xenolinguistics team decoded as something like received and used, and then they continued on their route. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. It was 2 species figuring out how to exist in the same solar system for the weeks it would take the migration to complete its passage, and it working. It working meant everything. Because the thing you learn when you have been in the business of translating dead languages long enough is that civilization is not an achievement. It is a practice. It is something you do, day after day, in all the small decisions about how to exist in the world alongside the things that are not you. The decision to be in relationship with something, to treat its needs as real, to include it in your navigation, to let the fact of its presence change the shape of how you move through the universe. This was not made once. It was made continuously, in every small exchange, in every data packet sent and received, in every course correction that took a few minutes and cost a few % of resources, and turned away from a thing that could have been a collision. Ilara put this in her report to the Council as early indication of cooperative behavioral compliance with Covenant terms. It was accurate. It was also the understatement of the year. She started having dinners again. This was something she had stopped doing after the scorching, not cooking, but the social practice of it, the gathering of people around food and staying long enough that the food went cold and nobody noticed because they were talking. She had not had people over for dinner in 7 years. She had eaten at her workstation or at briefings or occasionally at functions she was required to attend. She had been fed rather than having eaten. Callow pointed this out one evening. which was a breach of the line between professional and personal that she allowed only because it was callow, and he was generally right when he crossed it. He said, "When did you last have someone over for dinner?" She said, "What?" He said, "Dinner, people, your quarters. When did you last do that?" She thought about it honestly, which took longer than it should have. She said, "Before the scorching." He said, "That's 8 years." She said, "Yes." He said nothing for a moment, which was the sound of someone not saying, "That's too long." He didn't need to say it. She already knew it. She started the dinners 3 weeks later. She invited Callow first, which was practical. He was the person she was most comfortable with. Then she invited Dr. Pema, which surprised them both, but felt right. Then she invited 2 of the senior xenolinguists who had been doing the hardest work on the Bloodfang translation framework, because they deserved to eat something at a table for once instead of at their workstations. They talked about work mostly, which was what she knew how to talk about. But somewhere in the middle of the second dinner, Dr. Pema said something about the view from the monastery in Bhutan before it burned, about the specific quality of light at high altitude in the early morning, and the conversation went somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had nothing to do with the migration or the covenant or the 47 years of work ahead of them. And Alara found herself talking about Lion, about what the light was like there before the scorching, about a specific cafe where she had worked on her doctoral dissertation, and where the coffee was mediocre, but the window table caught the afternoon sun in a way that made everything seem more possible. She had not talked about Lion in 8 years. She talked about it for 40 minutes. When the dinner ended and the guests had gone and Callow was the last one there, helping her clear the table because he always helped her clear the table, she said, "I haven't talked about that city since the fire." He said, "I know." She said, "It felt all right." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think I've been holding it at a distance because looking at it directly felt like it would be too much." He said, "And was it?" She thought about Vrethka's jaw nodes producing the word for "I see you." She thought about the moment in Dr. Pema's sessions when she had stopped standing at the far end of the room from her own grief. She thought about how the fear doesn't go away, but how you can stop letting it run the operation once you stop hiding from it. She said, "No, it was fine. It was just a city I loved. It was just the place where I did my best thinking, and the coffee was bad, and the light in the afternoon was extraordinary." He said, "That's a nice thing to remember." She said, "Yes, it is." The 40th parallel had been a boundary line in the Bloodfang navigational adjustment, a coordinate that appeared in the data packets they exchanged, and that Alara's team had been working to understand for 3 months. When they finally decoded its significance, it turned out to be the marker for the outermost ring of what the Bloodfang considered Vrethka's navigation domain, the space she personally guided and maintained, the territory of her specific authority. Earth was inside it. This was not an accident. Vrethka had included the solar system in her personal navigation domain as a matter of deliberate mapping, which in Bloodfang convention meant something closer to the human concept of stewardship than territory. She was not claiming Earth. She was taking responsibility for it. She was including it in the web that she maintained, in the set of fixed stars she navigated from. In the Bloodfang understanding, you couldn't be responsible for something you didn't acknowledge as real. The first step of any kind of care was presence, the genuine, undefended recognition that something was there and that it mattered. Alara had understood this intellectually for months. When she read the navigation domain data, she understood it in a different way. The way you understand something when it becomes personal, rather than theoretical. She sat at her workstation for a long time after reading it. Then she sent Vrethka a navigational data update routine, well within the Covenant framework cartographic information about 3 stellar objects in the corridor ahead that human instruments had better resolution on than Bloodfang instruments did. She labeled the update clearly. She included a note in the transmission, using the resonance encoding they'd developed. from the fixed star, for the navigator, safe travels. It was not the language of diplomacy. It was the language of two people who had been sending signals to each other across the dark for long enough that the language had become their own. She sent it and went back to work. The mural in the chapel was added to 3 more times over the following year. Someone painted stars in the space between the two figures, not schematic stars, not astronomical notations, but small 5-pointed things the way children draw stars, the way the concept of a star looks before you know what a star actually is. They covered the space between the two figures completely, so that what had been empty was now full of small lights. Someone else added in the lower corner a small figure that was clearly meant to be a child. It was not a skilled painting. The proportions were approximate, the lines not entirely confident, but it was unmistakable. A small figure, not quite human-shaped and not quite not, reaching up toward the stars with both hands. The 3rd edition appeared overnight, and no one ever identified who was responsible. It was a single line, added at the very top of the mural where the wall was tallest, in letters large enough to be read from across the nave. We were never alone. We just didn't know how to listen. Alara went to the chapel once, 6 months after the ceremony, in the early morning before the day's work started. She hadn't planned to. She had been in Reims for a logistics meeting and had found herself walking up the hill before she had consciously decided to. She stood in the nave for a long time and looked at the mural, at the two figures, at the stars someone had painted between them, at the child reaching upward, at the words at the top. She thought about Myra. She thought about Myra laughing in a green field with her hair going in 3 directions. She thought about the photograph in her coat pocket, worn soft now from being handled. She thought, you would have liked this. You would have stood here and asked me 100 questions, and I would have answered all of them, and some of my answers would have been wrong, and you would have known, and you would have asked the next question anyway. She thought, I carry you forward, that's what carrying means. You're a fixed star, I navigate from you. I know where I am because I know where you were. She stood there for 20 minutes, then she went back down the hill and got back to work. The navigational exchange continued for all 47 years. Long after Alara had retired from the Reclamation Corps, long after Callow's daughter Myra was old enough to join the translation project herself and contribute work that made the earlier frameworks look primitive, long after the teams had expanded and the data had grown, and the language they'd built had become sophisticated enough to carry genuine complexity. Long after all of this, the signal continued. From Earth every morning at 5:30 Standard Time. Updated cartographic data, navigational notes, the accumulated work of the year. From Vrethka, at irregular intervals that seemed to correspond to the Bloodfang equivalent of when she had something to say. Resonance patterns that had grown richer and more complex as the translation framework matured, that addressed topics ranging from navigational data to something that the linguists eventually determined was the Bloodfang version of reflection, looking back at where you had been and what you had understood there, to know better where you were now. In the 32nd year of the exchange, Vrethka sent a pattern that took the translation team 4 weeks to render, and that Myra, who was by then the senior xenolinguist on the project, brought to Alara personally. Alara was 71. She had finally moved to Mars, had finally visited her mother-in-law, had finally stopped working 17-hour days. She still worked. She had simply renegotiated with the work. Myra brought her the translation on a Tuesday morning and sat across from her while she read it. What Vrethka had sent, in the language they had built together over 32 years, was this. I am approaching the outer range of communication. The distance will make the signals slower and eventually too diffuse to be reliable. Before the signal degrades, I want to send this clearly. I carried what we did at Reims for 32 years, and it was the correct weight. It changed the shape of my navigation in ways I could not have anticipated when I was standing on that hill looking at a small burned planet and hearing the signal that said I'm here. It was the correct weight. I carry your dead as fixed stars. I navigate from them. When I look back across the distance, I will look here. I will always look here. Alara read it twice, then she set it down on the table. Myra said, "Are you all right?" Alara said, "Yes." Myra said, "It's beautiful." Alara said, "Yes, start drafting the response. I want it out by this afternoon. Tell her we carry hers too. Tell her we navigate from her as well. Tell her the fixed stars go in both directions." Myra said, "I already started." Alara looked at her, at this young woman who had grown up knowing that the universe contained the Bloodfang, that the universe contained 900 million individuals in migration who had once been on a collision course with everything and had turned, had altered the corridor, because one navigator had looked at a burned planet and heard a signal in the dark and found it worth answering. She looked at her and thought, this is what I was doing it for. This, right here, not just the planet being safe. This, the world where you grew up knowing that the universe is large and not empty and that the signals you send into the dark come back. She said, when the response is ready, I want to add one line at the end, from me personally. Myra said, of course, what do you want to say? Alara thought for a moment. She thought about a chapel on a hill outside a city that used to be called Reims. She thought about the morning light on bleached stone. She thought about a pulse on a specific frequency, sent into the dark 14 times before an answer came back, barely distinguishable from background noise. She said, tell her I'm still here. Myra wrote it down. They sent it that afternoon on the Bloodfang frequency, tight beam, precisely aimed at a corridor 2,000 light-years long moving away from the solar system at a fraction of the speed of light, carrying 900 million individuals and one navigator who had turned toward a burned planet in the dark and found something worth navigating toward. I'm still here. And the universe, as it tends to do with the things that are patient enough and honest enough and willing enough to keep sending the signal, the universe answered.